Okay, so while you guys get settled, I just want to say good evening and welcome to Queering New York, the CLAGS Seminar in the city. CLAGS being the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies. I'm Dr. Jen Jack Easting, visiting assistant research professor here at the CUNY Graduate Center. If you've never been to the CUNY Graduate Center before, there are I believe 34 CUNYs at this point, all through the city. About 1 in 10 people in New York is taking a class at a CUNY right now, and the Graduate Center, could you move just a little left?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No sweat. I'm sure that people will tweet about your heads. The Graduate Center is the only PhD granting institution in the city of New York system. And the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, I'm pointing to these folks because they have computers because they're wonderful. You guys will introduce yourself. And checking that the live stream works and tweeting if you guys have questions to ask that way too. I just thought I would start and say a few things about our readings, and about today's class, and about the aim of this class, and where we're headed. I think folks will probably be coming in a little bit longer, and then we'll kind of shut the door just to make it quiet in case anything goes by. And my impetus for teaching this class. So I'm a PhD in environmental psychology, which is a rare little bird of a program, which is actually this program. This class is sponsored by the Environmental Psychology Program at CUNY, the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, the Center for Study of Women's Society, and of course, the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies. This is a dream of a course. This course has been a dream of mine to teach for about 6 or 7 years. So I was really excited that the opportunity came up to teach a seminar in the city. We didn't expect such a big interest, but I'm glad you are all interested. I really am. This is what I think about, and this is what my work is about. I'm writing a book called Queer New York about lesbian and queer women's experiences of social and spatial justice in New York City from 1983 to 2008. From AIDS to the L word, did it really get better? So that's what my research is about. And I'm sure you have lots of opinions about that, and I'm excited to hear them. Beyond that, I wanted to say that the impetus for teaching this course is to really grow our consciousness and learn about the work that's out there. A lot of the ways we produce ourselves as LGBTQ people, or at least I do, and a lot of people in my research did, is through queer theory and about LGBTQ studies. I think there's a lot to learn and a lot of exciting work out there. And space is really sexy. Who doesn't like to talk about space and place? And New York is perhaps one of the sexiest places out there. So this makes a really great place to start this conversation and to share it with all of you. I also wanted to just go around the room and you say your name, which I'm pretty good with names. I don't think I'll memorize them all tonight. But I'm excited for y'all to share your names, and that way maybe you can talk to one another and be in conversation. I also hope you also take the time afterwards or before or even during to talk with one another. A lot of people were like, I'm so excited to take the class and meet other people in the class. I think it's a really exciting chance to do that and have this conversation. So why don't we just start with names? I'm Jack.
I'm Robert.
Simone.
Tina.
Ken.
Kate.
Nick.
Adam.
Rebecca.
Michael.
Mark.
Julia. Barbara.
Tristan.
Karen. Quinn.
Seher.
Sandra. Jamie. Lucia.
James.
Mika.
Alex.
Sarah.
Jenna.
YB. Cookie. Meredith.
Colin.
Diana.
Leilani.
Skip.
And
Skip.
Phil.
I'm Trina.
Oh, yeah, Trina.
Kate. I'm Julia.
I'm Yana.
Roy.
Linda.
Yasmina.
And Kelly.
Our friends from CLAGS, and also who wanted to come. So in talking, just to kick us off, thank you for sharing your names and being a part of this. I wanted to throw it out there and ask what anybody's first responses were to these readings or thoughts about them. Written so far apart. John D'Amelio's written in 1983. I bet you could tell he's talking about lesbians and gay men only. No one else seems to have existed yet, but we know that's not a truth. And he has this really interesting, kind of amazing idea about how capitalism made lesbian and gay culture possible on such a large scale. It's kind of become a pretty accepted idea in LGBTQ studies. Though it's not talked about a lot, it's really an undercurrent of things. He also has some really cool ideas about family that are still very true. And not there, but somebody can make arguments about gentrification being kind of a big thing about how we move through families and how we can make our spaces or not. And then Julie Abraham, if you liked I haven't met her, so I'm not advertising her book for her, but I love this book. So Metropolitan Lovers it's really edible, really good. And I was really moved by her comparison of Jane Jacobs, fighter for the streets, to James Baldwin, of all people, which is just so awesome. And to think about them in New York at the same moment. And how deviance ruled the idea of the city. Come on in. How deviance ruled the city and how people responded to that and how it was used in war. So I'm going to throw that to you guys, and then I will move the conversation along. And if you don't have something to say, or if you have questions, yeah.
Yeah, I really like the piece about Baldwin and Jane Jacobs, and I never really thought of those two as being related. I mean, I like both writers. I live in the West Village, so thank you, Jane Jacobs, for saving my neighborhood. But also the word attachment, I remember, came up a lot in those pieces. And I thought, because I am so attached to New York City, I really like that the parallel that both the writers made of being, a gay person attached and the neighborhood attachment. And anyway, I just wanted to throw out that word attachment because that really jumped out at me in that piece.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of talk about LGBTQ space or LGBTQ life is about absences or what places close down or, Caddyshack isn't there, or whatever insert name of bar there, is not there, or how long Stonewall wasn't there and then was rebuilt. I like the attachment as well. Oh yeah.
From the D'Amelio piece, which I read years ago, and it was really fun to read again. I got so many new things from it this time. But I think that I thought what was really interesting is, he talks about how capitalism made it possible for people to, for individuals to, essentially the onus is on yourself, irrespective of gender. And we know there's a huge, wage gap in gender and race and all these things, but the onus is on a single person to financially provide for yourself. And so it's interesting that also at the same time, the movement for marriage among gay and lesbian people has become this, the championing fight when essentially, he's arguing that the individuality and the destruction of that system of your family for survival is what made us queer, or not made us queer, but what made possible for the identity.
Right. And the difference, the argument for difference. He has this really great sentence somewhere when he talks about that it was the moment of the 40s that differentiated us by race, by class, by gender, by sexuality. But at the same time, it's that difference we keep wanting to celebrate. And that's what I really thought about when forming the syllabus. How can we celebrate difference? How can we really observe difference and hear each other's perspectives and make room for that in the space, especially in cities?
I think it's interesting, I know D'Amelio's work in disability studies, and so it's interesting how his argument here, his is definitely sort of an inclusion model, the idea of becoming included in the legal system via rights, and that's sort of how he ends this article, and that's sort of how his stance is in disability studies, and sort of the opposite terrain in disability studies is the idea of not inclusion, but on sort of decentering the self. And so, and I think that's more along Baldwin's sort of not thinking, but it's interesting how these different writers come along with solutions. For D'Amelio, it's inclusion. For Baldwin, it's sort of the negotiation within a space that's not liberatory. He doesn't see freedom in the street. And for Jacobs, it is sort of an urban planning. So I just think it's interesting to see what solutions or what sort of tacts they take in seeing like, I guess more happiness. I guess the goal is seeing more happiness, right, or more freedom in the world.
Right.
You know?
And I think a lot of that had to do with race. I mean, I thought the race, I mean, I love the Abraham. I just think there was so much more going on with race to be dealt with that was kind of, that went fed his isolation as well. And there were some key quotes she pulled out, but I just thought that his experience of racism and being black in New York at that point, or at any point in the history of this country or this world, fed his ideas of being gay.
I think building on that and also going back to attachment, thinking about kind of attachment versus belonging versus inclusion and kind of how those work and the questions that have kind of brought up between those three concepts and even more, and talking about even, you know, how that relates to visibility and legibility was something that was brought up too throughout the reading. So thinking about how those types of terms kind of negotiate, you know, throughout these pieces, but also, you know, what you think wins out in certain contexts versus not.
Does anybody want to keep silly responding all the time? I can jam all night long on this stuff. Well, it's funny, this word legibility, right? Because visibility is, I got really upset about the word visibility because there's a lot of stuff written about lesbians as being invisible, and I'm so not invisible. I mean, I'm 6 foot tall, and I have this bow tie and this hair, like you can't miss me. And so, and I'm sure you all experienced that, this visibility and visibility thing comes up, and it's used in something, I started counting, but I cited over 500 things in my dissertation, and around 60-some% of them use the word visibility that I noticed. Like I just kept circling and keeping a tally. And it's used for us a lot, or I say us in this way that I mean in talking about LGBTQ people in this work. It's used for that group a lot, and I don't know, do you think it's a fair word to use?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think back to covering and passing as choices when your environment is dangerous. And so it's partly about legibility among friends, but it's very much about choices to be visible or invisible or barely visible among hostile people.
I'm thinking about, how many people, I was just talking to somebody from AVP about how many people don't report cases of violence. Oh, what were you going to say?
I was just going to bring up this part from Julie Abraham, where I think she's citing this, I had never heard of this author before, William White.
Yeah.
Our City's Not American, and she brings, and he cites, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, he doesn't. She cites Proust, right? And she says, he cites Proust describing both parties speaking the same language, even though they had never seen one another before. So it's not so much that you're illegible or invisible to some, but visible to those who sort of speak your language.
Right.
Like communists and presidents and whoever.
Right. And that goes a lot with cruising, like
Yeah.
the experience of cruising. And not that I only read about it. But what you read about, I mean, just the eye gestures or George Chauncey, which I think he's going to talk about in the chapter when we read him in 2 weeks, talks about that you just, in the 20s, you would say, do you have a match? Or what's the time? And this was a code. And I remember being floored by that was a way to meet someone to hook up with them. So I think the codes have grown somewhat. There's there are so many pocket handkerchiefs and so many websites about them. And so many other ways of doing that and identifying yourself. Well, what else were you thinking? Did this apply to your life at all, or anybody's life that you know? Or?
Well, it seems hard to be invisible today. I mean, you sit on the subway and you're queer looking, and everybody notices you, especially if you're with your girlfriend. And you don't know what they're thinking. You don't know if it's hostile, curiosity, noting difference. Maybe it's just appreciating beauty. You know, so unless we really survey or start a dialogue, we don't know how visible we are in contemporary life.
Yeah. And how many times that I had a really horrible experience in the 90s where I thought someone was coming after me and my girlfriend after we kissed in a Starbucks in Boston. We were literally running away, and this guy finally caught up to us. He was in his 50s and he was crying. He's like, "That was so beautiful. I'm sorry I scared you. I'm gay too. I've never seen anyone do that before." And I remember it was this as if my whole worldview had shifted. My entire life was tipped over about what it could be and finding one another. That, maybe it wasn't a place of fear. Maybe cities weren't a place of fear. Do you feel comfortable in New York City? Or do you know people who do? Or what are your experiences of New York City? Yeah.
You remember me?
Of course I do.
My experience is more like an experience of invisibility, which sometimes I'm very thankful for, but sometimes it's a little frustrating. Like, people look at me like the first thought isn't gay, because it's like I sort of present the kind of them. It sort of also made me think of, there was that picture I keep thinking of that Ouija did. One of the hands, I don't remember which one, I think it was the older hand, there were two girls in a bar.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
One of them you look and you go, okay, she looks, but the other one, if you just saw the picture of her alone, and you didn't know she was with a girlfriend, you didn't know it was in the gay bar, you would never know. So I think femmes, it's more about sort of a struggle to be visible and, someone who's more obviously gay, But it also, I think that gay bars as a whole kind of shine a light, like they make the non-visible visible. As soon as you walk into a gay bar, you said a statement about yourself without saying anything. So that's why I find it interesting, the whole concept of gay bars and gay spaces.
Well, that goes back to that great point about that great point about attachment too, and belonging. How can do we want to belong, and how does visibility work through that? Like, do we want to be attached, and can we be attached, and how much are we allowed to be attached if we're protecting ourselves, or starting this dialogue right now? What were you going to say?
I just moved here 3 months ago from Laramie, Wyoming. So it's kind of like I finally reached the Mecca or something. Everything's supposed to be totally cool. And I think for the most part it is. I love New York. Okay. But I think what I've been thinking about and what Karen and I have been talking a lot about in terms of this notion of invisibility and visibility has to do for me at this point more with gender. And things are totally cool with me until I have to use the restroom, right? And that's of course been a place and a space that's been for genderqueer people, for butches, a space that is incredibly uncomfortable. And so, I think that I'm mostly invisible until I have to try and be the right kind of woman in the restroom. And then I'm clearly visible because I'm not supposed to be there because I don't read as female right away. And I think the other thing I've been thinking about with that in terms of visibility and invisibility is the most recent sort of coming out stories of the basketball player, the NBA player, who got a call from Obama, right? He's on Good Morning America. It's a huge deal. Brittany Griner, the #1 pick in the WNBA, comes out, signs a big deal with Nike. It's barely on SportsCenter. And I know that's maybe a different conversation. I'm an ex-athlete, so it's kind of something that I think about a lot, but talk about invisible. I mean, Brittany Griner is, she was like, yeah, I'm gay, it's cool. And everyone's like, whatever, and then this guy comes out and gets a call from Obama. Brittany Griner didn't get a call from Obama. So I mean, it's again, the sort of, the bringing together of gender and visibility and invisibility, like, oh yeah, of course, you're a female athlete, so you must be gay. We don't really care anymore.
But it's totally tied to economics, right? I mean, there's not enough money to be made up of women's sports versus men's. Same with the invisibility of women's spaces. There's not enough money fronted by women to open up spaces for women compared to bars for men. So it's all basically a lot of it's tied to economics, and of course other intersectional issues. But that's huge when it comes to the difference between men and women in terms of queerness.
If capitalism is the problem, right?
And then he's also saying it's the freedom, we get to take our labor wherever we want. To these cities, I guess. So or places that we feel safe. I think, you know, there's a lot more work coming out about how the rural is a good space for people. You might have heard of Judith Jack Halber's family.
Yeah, that's a tough one,
Is that
sorry.
right? And Jack's book on In a Queer Time and Place has a really good chapter about the Brandon Archive and about that specific chapter. Jack's and writer and scholar. And but that chapter is really useful, and what Jack does is goes to Omaha to actually, why would anyone, Lincoln, or outside of Lincoln, where Brandon Tina was, why would anyone stay here? You know, she can't get her head around it. Why would anyone go there? So she rereads this entire thing instead of through these documentaries, these big feature films, trying to really understand the rural, which is really key. But in the same way, you just said the Mecca, the Promised Land, you know, Cass Weston wrote this great famous piece in 1995, "Get thee to a big city," you know? We would all be safe and find one another. And that happens in the movie Milk, you know, where the teenage, right? Oh, there's this huge nodding in the background. That the teenager, you know, if he can get away, you know, Harvey Milk tells him, if you can get to a city, it'll be great. And somebody does, someone takes care of him and takes him in, and that's great. And we still have that idea, you know, cities permit some sort of difference. Yeah.
I think I'm not a very huge fan of Dan Savage, although he's done good things. But I think that, you know, I once in a while will listen to his podcast just to get mad. And, you know, I feel like there's all of these, you know, teens who are like semi-closeted, and he's like, get out of your piece of shit town and move to New York or San Francisco, you know? And that's like this narrative that, like, you know, there's not queer people in Laramie. I used to live in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's like close by, you know, and like and you know, there is this sort of like, the city is this like safe haven for queer people. At the same time, it's like, what queer people? Maybe people who have some or a lot of white privilege that are from New York or come to New York, but I feel like there's so many people being killed and
homeless.
And
working the streets and on drugs.
In New York too, and it's not this like gay safe haven, and you can't just tell everyone to move to New York and it'll be okay. And not to say that I feel like we're all deeply attached, that's why we're here, you know, but it's just not this safe place. And it's also a strange show. We think about like the reason that these gay meccas were created. Like, one is like capitalism from D'Amelia's perspective, and like another one is war, right? Like all these like really gross things that were sort of like, it's in our blood to be against those as queer people. It's like, oh, well, like war created these ports and then everyone went to those, and then, you know, and that's how we have this queer mecca. And then like capitalism made it so we can leave our families and we can be in the city. And I don't think that it's maybe not that, it's obviously not totally that simple, but there's shitty things that have brought this about, and there's also shitty things that keep happening.
Yeah. And going with the war, there was a really interesting thing that happened that no one wrote about, which was that when DADT was repealed, all the armed forces recruiters were let back on campuses they had never been, but but that made no sense. It was about, they had stopped because of Vietnam, but they had let them back in because they took gays in. So it was against war, but then they let them back in because they like gays. I didn't follow that at all. But that is really interesting to think about how war influences this as well, because that's not what he focused on. He's focusing on the economic argument. So the war is really key to that.
I think though the one thing about the rural, I mean, it's no longer, like I taught women's studies in Laramie, and one of the interesting things that I would interact with students over is not go to the city because you're queer, but also for like things like education and economic reasons, because there aren't jobs in the rural to sustain young people. And so it becomes also tied to material again, that like even if people want to stay, queer people or otherwise, like young people want to stay in towns like Laramie, there's not an economic base to support them. And so like I think that that's another interesting piece that ties to D'Amelio's article, like in terms of, I don't know, and that's just one of the problems that I have, like with the way that Jack frames the rural, is thinking that, you know, that there are places for them to even be, you know what I mean? Like economically, it becomes sort of a a double issue of like, I want to encourage my students to get education and come to classes like this. And so I don't want to say stay in the rural because you can make a place there, and if you want to stay there, you should, because there aren't jobs there. So it's complicated.
And that's even changed so much in the last, 8 years since that book came out. I mean, that's what,
Exactly.
like, those towns are dying so much more after the housing crisis.
Exactly.
That's since 2008. You were saying?
So I was just looking at this quote, I want to argue that gay men and lesbians have not always existed. And I was just thinking about how he's talking about the sort of political movement in the 70s, and everyone's kind of producing this argument about, oh, we always were just right next door, you just didn't know. And so like flash forward all of these years, I was kind of curious about whether people in this room like buy his argument hook, line, and sinker, or if, it seems like at least the queer political movement still kind of uses this in many ways, uses that same kind of, we're your next door neighbors, we've always been here, we existed in Greek times, whatever. And so I'm just sort of, because, an academic,
I buy it. I think identity has a lot to do with who you are able to interact with and what kind of micro interactions occur. And I wouldn't say homosexuality has always existed any more than I would say African American identity with the history of slavery has always existed. They're absolutely historical, even though they're very deeply personal. So, somebody 100 years ago might have thought of themselves as having desires, and maybe in the right place it might have been possible to act on them, but they wouldn't have had a sense of power or community or legitimacy in the same way at all, I don't think.
That reminds me of this woman in my research who read in 7th grade that the women, it was about the Mormons, that the women lived apart from the men, and they were very happy. I'm a bigamist. Like that's how she found out what she was. That's what she thought she was for 5 years of her life. And I love that story that for most of her teens she thought she was a bigamist because she loved women. So like what knowledge we have and what we have access to produces things too. Like that's really key and really informative.
Well, what might be the cost from framing one's life around sexuality, which is one of the things that Emilio brings up. Like now that we have this ability to create our lives around our sexuality, are there things that are lost in that, in that trajectory?
So I'm a reproductive health specialist, so I'm a healthcare provider, and so everyone tells me all their business, like that is my business. And so I think the idea of, identity and what you're doing, we clearly know are two separate things, right? And they always are that way for many people, but even in New York City. I think that's something like in an academic room, we take privilege and say, well, your behavior, you can identify it or not identify it, it's not a big deal. But for a lot of people, it is a big fucking deal. And when they have to put that on the table and say, I do these behaviors, I do these other behaviors, I don't want any identities, how do I navigate that world? And then they come and see me and they think, here's this like straight lady who's gonna like, fuck with my shit. And then they find out, no, that's not the case. Like you can't, as much as you don't want me to have a perception of who you are, you shouldn't presume who I am. And like that's an interesting dynamic. So when we're talking about does this resonate with your life, about visibility and invisibility, in this room I'm visible, but in my clinic I'm totally invisible to most of my patients unless they ask enough questions. And like it's not, they don't need to necessarily know my life outside of here. So
it's like what Barbara said, like until we start that moment of the dialogue, like what happens? We just kind of nod to each other on the subway.
Yeah, it popped into mind a book I read by a sociologist, Wayne Breckles, called Peacock Censor Chameleon, which is actually a study of a northern New Jersey town and the different ways that gay men behave. And there's one of the three groups, the chameleon, has one kind of presentation in the suburbs and then comes into the city and does something very different, right? So so it isn't always the case. Some people have a very strong sense of I'm always this way, and other people will change their presentation depending on what circumstances, and they will adjust what they feel like. They'll move around, and in a sense, I think that's what James Baldwin did. I was thinking a lot about the comparison with Baldwin, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
You go to Paris at the time he did. You're not black in the same way at all as you are in an American city.
Right.
And in fact, a lot of people for a long time, a lot of gay men went to Paris because they weren't, I mean, the French Revolution got rid of the sodomy law. So, you know, there was a different kind of culture in Paris and a lot of rural places or a lot of other cities. So people move, but they don't just move. I mean, that really and truly people, I live in New Jersey, they move back and forth between New Jersey and New York on a sort of weekend or, you know, monthly cycle to have different kinds of interactions.
Or even through New York. I mean, just
Well, that's also true.
like how your identities shift as you move through different,
People will live in the outer boroughs and then come into Manhattan and have a very different presentation.
or how Midtown is just so desexualizing generally. You know?
Right.
It's just, there's so many
Times Square.
amplified. Yeah.
Right, I was just gonna lead off of that. With respect to the second reading, there's a comment about James Baldwin saying that when people move, say, from the south to the north, they don't move from, they don't move to Chicago, they move to the south side. They don't move to Manhattan, they move to Harlem. So even within an urban community, there are sort of smaller communities or spaces where they can probably sort of negotiate a balance between those spaces that they can be out and those spaces where they can, balance the sort of class, race, racial identity.
But I get worried about the homogenization of our culture, especially in an urban setting. And so I think this movement back and forth from rural to the city is really important. I'm, lucky enough to have a place upstate, and so my neighbor is an ex-detective. He watches our property, and we talk lesbian life to him, and I have a chance mingling with those people to meet people I don't meet in the city and have no opportunity to. So I kind of think we're at the stage, once we get rooted in our identity, that we can play off this. Anyway, it's all performance, right? So.
Judith was here.
I kind of had a difficult. The same quote that you were talking about, as far as I think you just talking about homogeneity really sparked it into me. The gay community has only existed in the way it has for in the recent sort of past. And I was in the capitalism article. I was interested in the fact that the author was outlining that the sort of that interactions were primarily in the nuclear family and kind of in the nuclear sort of economic unit, and slowly over time they became more and more joined and kind of together as a sort of a mass society. We've kind of become a homogenous sort of thing, or we've kind of become gay or whatever, or lesbians or queer. And I kind of felt that was although I think he's factually true, we've only been gay in the way that we are gay for this moment. I felt that was also very unsatisfying. And I thought that it was, I thought it failed to capture a lot. I felt all the sort of cultures that that didn't have written language, or kind of for a long time, or had oral sort of traditions, I thought that sort of the interpersonal connections that exist in society and kind of aren't on the written page or aren't in book volumes, that's not captured. And I kind of felt it was an easy sort of buyout that the capitalism author, he was kind of falling into his own sort of idea that the economy has made us one sort of entity, and therefore we are just one.
I don't really think that was what Emilio was saying exactly. I mean, I think he was saying something that capitalism made a particular identity possible. Not that they were not gay, not that they were not homoerotic acts.
Right.
I mean, the Greeks were perfectly capable of thinking you might have greater interest in other men than you might, or something else, but that wasn't a major way of separating people or organizing their society. So while homosexuality certainly existed, gayness,
I do agree,
a modern concept.
I do agree though, but it's I think it has to do with the way that I see myself relative to the broader gay identity. Is I kind of see myself first as an individual. And I feel as a unit of kind of a number of other identities, like my friend group or my family or that sort of stuff. And so I didn't quite understand that, didn't quite jive with my worldview.
No, and it doesn't have to, and I'm glad you said that. the other thing that's really interesting is it's 1983, but I don't know if you, I bet a lot of you thought there was something really missing from this argument, which is that AIDS is just starting, right? And it's about to radically change what lesbian and gay is to everyone in the world. I always read this and I'm always like, what? How did you fail to account for? I was like, oh, 1983. You know, like you're hoping it's going to stop anymore. And it's not. But I think there are all these other identities, and I think I wonder how many of them would have come out. A lot of them came out of a lot of the activism from the 80s and the 90s, or the loss, like very personalized loss and agony that of a pandemic and genocide of people. There's also something that capitalism does, that it loves to commodify whatever's sexy, whatever's new, whatever's next. And I know a group of very sexy people. I'm sure you've heard of them. They're called gay and lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer people. And they supposedly have very nice, pretty real estate and great clothes. And that these kind of images are reproduced. And for some people, it's acceptance, and for some people, it's homogenizing. And in the 90s, a lot of people thought it was really great, you know, to see that rainbow item in the store, in the regular store, you know, to go to a separate store. You saw the sticker on the door and you were welcome there. And then everybody had a sticker because you were really welcome there because you had money. What's changed since then has changed all those relationships too. I can't even imagine what it was like to write this at that moment. Like, I can't. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me. I took an advertising class and it was about like the pink dollar and like like how much money gay people have and how like you know to capture that market, and like it was apparently like I think like Calvin Klein or some like very famous designer made these ads where it was like there was a certain like symbol in it where like the gays would know what it is, and the straights like wouldn't. It was like very about to like.
Does anybody know what that was? I don't know.
I don't know. I can find it, but it was like super interesting because it was like there was this huge assumption of like this population will notice this one thing. It was like very like bizarre. I don't know. Kind of similar. Yeah.
So they're talking about there was an androgynous ad. There was like a couple, and you couldn't really tell. I mean, it was. I did actually spend time finding out, and it was a male and a female couple. But the angle made it look like you can't really tell, and this was like the 90s ad.
Yeah, so the capitalism is a double-edged sword because it also builds communities. I mean, when I was coming out, you had the lesbian music and Olivia Cruises and all that stuff.
And
so
the Olivia label.
So you had a way of people finding each other through buying things together. Right. But what I really
and selling things to one another.
Well, yes, and then when big style capitalism started to market to gays, frankly, although I found it kind of pathetic in a way because it narrows the choices, it also meant we were here to stay because we meant money to people. That's a cynical view, but I think it's actually the way it worked. It wasn't politics. It was when, about 15 years ago, advertisers started seeing there was a gay submarket that they wanted.
I think we should be really careful about this weed, though, and I'm going to bring it up.
About what?
About this weed, because
About this what?
Question the weed. Let's queer that.
Oh,
I was working really briefly for a candidate for city council.
Yeah.
And actually running against Christine Quinn. Anyway, and I went to a, I guess like a community meeting. I think they were talking about law enforcement and giving more money to the police department. And it was one of the things on the agenda was closing the PATH train earlier because the youth, the queer youth coming in from New Jersey were bringing in all this crime. Right?
Sorry.
And predominantly Latino, predominantly Black, and this wasn't, of course, mentioned, but like, they're clearly not part of the us. I mean, for those people of this community, right? I mean, like, and so I think for a lot of people, still the city is a safe haven, and that really, I think, we should foster. And if that, I don't think that's a homogenization either.
No, I mean, one of the members of the New Jersey Four is still in prison.
There was the quote of Jacob's, right, where she's like, describes how, I forget what the exact quote was, but you know, like all these different people, like all the different kinds of people on her block that she sees.
In her sidewalk ballet, which are
Right,
how many
right,
blocks
right,
from the Chelsea, from the piers, from the Christopher Street piers.
Right, going to the
I have a feeling she wasn't hanging out on as much as other spaces where whatever she was on Hudson Street, I think. But no, I was getting very angry thinking about the New Jersey Four, which I don't know if all of you know about, which is a group of African American women who were being harassed by teenagers who were late teens who were being harassed by an older man, also of color. They were women of color, and then he kept pushing them and nudging them, and they fought back. And one of them had a knife, and 4 of them went to prison. And one of them is still in prison since 2007.
I remember that.
And is this what happens when we fight back? Why? How is this? How is that possible? Sorry, I am.
I mean, it's an inclusive politics, but it's also exclusive.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say on the point of like what you were saying, a lot of the argument for gay marriage is how much industry it will bring to the state, because people will have weddings and that's more weddings and more money for people who support stuff like that. So.
A lot of the recent comments have me wondering about how things have changed since the times that are being written about in these pieces. The Abraham piece is recent, but it's about the 60s, and obviously it's written about the early 80s. And so they're about times when the city is this place of kind of degeneracy and diversity in a bad way. And I feel like sort of since the 80s, both LGBTQ people have become more accepted in the broader world, and I think the vision of cities has kind of changed in that time, and how those two things fit together, and what someone like D'Amelio would sort of think about. I mean, obviously he's around, so we could ask him, but
I would love that.
About where we are now, right, and how that relates to what he wrote in 1983, and if he would revise his arguments in some kind of way, or if there were sort of problematic tendencies in the connection between cities and queers that he did not see yet.
So this just, for some reason, made me think about, they just recently decided to cancel Folsom Streets, that whole thing, where,
which is the leather.
Right, like the fetish. And sort of there's been this ongoing fight between the LGBT presence in that area near the High Line with the Eagle Bar and that kind of thing, and then the new, the people coming in and they're in the condos, and, the whole gentrification, and they sort of don't want to have this whatever festival where they're like taking they're walking their babies and their children by, and they're like scared. So it's like this whole fight, but it's like who owns the space? The people who have been there for a while, or the people who are just coming in that time?
Yeah, I want to say on that topic, if you want to read more about that topic and about a really great book, which actually is focused on the economy and about, it's called, I believe, Techniques of Pleasure by Margot Weiss. It's a professor at Wesleyan who spent many years doing an ethnography of the S&M community in San Francisco, and about who has the privilege to buy all those toys and all that equipment. You're all nodding.
Also David Engstrom.
The kinship?
Yeah.
Such a good point. And David Engstrom kinship.
The privatization of public space.
Yeah. Oh, and Colin.
Yeah, I just was going to say that I think this question of homogenization and visibility is an important one. Thinking of the Abraham piece, where basically the contrast of the suburb to the city was that the identity there was that there's a lack of group identity and a lack of attachment to space, and that allowed for this almost loss of visibility and this normalization process, right? And I think a lot of the current discourse and the kind of mainstream LGBT movement, right, is of that normalization nature, where it's almost a prelude to a loss of visibility in a certain way. And then it's important for us to remember which bodies are visible in what way and who that benefits, right? And I think the Folsom example is a great one of how the production of space can lead to the homogenization of identities, right? Or the loss of a certain type of visibility.
There's also an historical element here. I mean, when I came out in the early 70s, joining what was a gay and lesbian community was not a choice, it was a necessity. It was self-protection to preserve yourself from getting beaten up on your way to the bars, or from the police, who close bars down until people stop them from doing it. The fact that it wound up in the 90s as a movement for marriage and being in the military was not most of our intention. You know, that happens to movements, you know, they change and the identities change.
Yeah, I'm also really interested in the way our identities as LGBT, whatever people change. Particularly, I'm thinking about kind of the identities in people of color communities that don't, you know, for instance, you know, there's African Americans who identify as same gender loving as opposed to lesbian or gay. You know, there's the two-spirit people, you know.
Aggressive.
Right.
As an identity.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. So
Yeah.
I'm really interested in how that plays into this discussion as well.
Right, and how many of those identities are attached to cities and why are they attached to cities? It's really interesting. I was doing my research. If you don't know what an aggressive is, it is usually an African American woman or Latina woman often uses it more often, but not always. It doesn't have much, it's still being determined and constantly used and recreated. And it was a term to say that these people were aggressive, and then it was claimed as an identity to be an aggressive. And then it's become somewhere around like 2005, 2006. There were people who came of age in the term aggressive who did not know what the word butch was. And so there's a split in those communities of creating, of this group creating their own identity, which is awesome and wonderful. And what does that mean? Like, why then? And how do they deploy it, and how is it changing? There's this great group, Brooklyn Boyhood. If you don't know them, God love them. They're awesome, and they're doing great work. I feel like, especially in John D'Amelio's idea, he was like really making a point that there were also Black people, and that was a really big deal for 1983. And I was like, whoa, you kind of miss. There's so many other people, obviously, that you haven't gotten to, and then Abraham starts to get to that, but much of that difference is erased in this we. I think one of you just said that. And how can we account for it differently, and how can we move ahead? If movements change, what would be different? What would you do besides marriage and military? You know, what's next? I think we're raising some really good ideas. And how can cities help us or not?
Well, I was just thinking that if the argument here is that capitalism kind of produced the ability for a certain kind of gay identity, then it seems like we can't totally blame the kind of gay political movement for becoming about the military and marriage. Maybe we need to blame capitalism again, right? Because like I speak all the time with my partner about how like if we genuinely want to have a child or something, we really need a third person in our relationship. Because you can't sustain like child rearing and the economics of a household in New York City on two incomes. Right, so I mean, on two real people incomes, right? So that the movement or whatever has like succumbed to the normativity of marriage and blah 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 seems like also kind of production of capitalism, and that's why I was asking. That's why I thought it was interesting to kind of interrogate this idea of like what it means to have existed.
I was just gonna say maybe we should start thinking about other issues as queer issues, like maybe like a minimum wage or a living wage.
What? What are you talking about?
No, but like, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. No, I mean, if women make, this is something I always, when I'm doing my talk about, it's like women make 77 cents on the dollar. That's on average. African American women, Latina women make about 67 cents to 65 cents on the dollar compared to white men. And if two women are going to make $1.54, and straight couple's going to make $1.77, and a gay male couple, this is very big generic terms, are $2. You're going to make $2 on the dollar. We see women, lesbians and queer women, not in Park Slope so much anymore, right? Right? Okay, big nods. And where are they? Where they have exploded and making Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, Ditmas Park, Sunset Park, and they can't afford Williamsburg, Greenpoint, parts of Queens. And when they get there, what do they do to try and make community? They empty out an empty lot and they build a community garden. And then they're going to build a nice health justice center which is really important and great, important place. And people are going to want to go there, right? So, and then there'll be families who like to go there. Look at how pretty the real estate is. There's a garden here. And these things change. I mean, you can see it happening across New York for, 25, 30 years. So gentrification is a big issue. Sarah Schulman's book, Gentrification of the Mind, it also just gentrification. If we look, there are people who were really proud to be the first lesbians, white lesbians, to move to Bed-Stuy, to move to Crown Heights, to make new communities. And they are 25 years later have gentrified themselves out of the next neighborhood, right? So that's gonna keep happening. That's something that threads us all together, unless you're super rich. So that's one issue. Health issues are really big. But what other issues were you thinking about besides?
Oh, I was just thinking about, I mean, like,
So we're not.
I don't know, in addition to sexuality, like what other things might link us to other movements? So that the movement isn't just around sexuality anymore. I mean, that's it is clearly, but there are like other things that must be, I think.
The next gentleman with the head is named.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Well, I mean, with respect to what you were saying, it's funny how the end of the D'Amelio article references all of that when he's talking about, our communities our survival and liberation depend on our ability to defend and expand that terrain, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. And then he goes on to talking about affirmative action for people of color and women, publicly funded daycare and other essential services, and the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's this sort of like implicit intersectionality kind of like piece if we're talking about, well then what is this other terrain? Which I think is really compelling.
And medical clinics, performance centers, public housing. Yeah, all of those things. Okay, there are some people over there.
I was gonna say, I think going off what you were saying, bringing an intersectional lens into all of it in terms of thinking about how we want to add, not talking about just a single issue, one-dimensional way of sort of fixing things, but also kind of in the range of like the gay marriage and DAT passing, also looking at then what happens in result to those laws, like here in New York, the quality of life laws and the hyper-policing of the village of where homeless youth would go on. That is kind of a backdrop of what happens when those laws are passed. So when we're thinking about not just like what issues we need to look at now, I think also looking at kind of the results of these single issue, in my opinion, very bad policies that pass and who gets affected by those. Because I think in those spaces we can really see the intersectionality happening and see a lot of those issues like healthcare, unemployment, prison industrial complex, all of that.
Stop and frisk right now.
Stop and frisk.
I mean, it's this perfect example which disproportionately affects youth of color, but if you are, not, your gender isn't clear as to what it says on your ID card, there's about a 70% chance that you're gonna get harassed or verbally assaulted or sexually assaulted. That teens have reported. There's great research by the Public Science Project, which is just down the hall, and they do participatory action research with groups all over the city about stop and frisk, and queer youth of color are really the ones who are suffering from this. They're the ones who have lost the piers. They're not at the piers anymore. That was a gathering ground and the Christopher Street piers for decades for LGBTQ people. Yeah, and for some people,
they're still there.
Still there. Go back for it. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah. Still okay. And now you're next. Now when I meet LGBT youth of color and they're talking to me, when we go to the piers, some nights you can't go. There's too many police. There's no place for them to use the bathroom. You have to buy something to sit down in a cafe in the West Village. You have to spend at least over $7 in some places, or $10. No matter how you look or who you are, and that's really to control youth of all types, but especially queer youth of color. And a lot of them hang out in Times Square now, because where can you be totally anonymous and totally visible all at once but in Times Square?
This is going back a little bit in our conversation, but I was just thinking about what you're saying about the changing of neighborhoods and people, lower income people moving to neighborhoods that are farther from Manhattan. Something that I found to be really difficult about being a queer and low-income person in New York is that since all of my friends are also low-income queer people in New York who live far from Manhattan, trying to see them if they don't live in the same section as I do takes forever, and I have to go through Manhattan, or we have to meet in Manhattan, and then we end up spending our money in Manhattan and spending more money on food and whatever it is we want to do, just so that we can spend time together. I think is a really common experience of being here in New York, which has to do with the way the subway lines operate. You know, I mean, going from Queens to Brooklyn is a nightmare.
Right, no, yeah.
Unless
Who would
you're
date
bike,
someone in Queens?
which a lot of people are biking, which I totally understand. I am not a biker currently, although I see the appeal. But then if bikes are the way to be queer and low income and still have friends in New York, then what about people who can't ride a bike? It's just like, I just see the levels like building where it is really hard to just see other groups you're already friends with.
That's such a great point. Yeah, that's
Okay. The point about kind of coalitional politics and finding issues that cross-cut communities, the way Jane Jacobs writes about the city, and to a lesser extent D'Amelio, city should be the ideal incubator of exactly that kind of thing. And there are certainly people who attempt that kind of politics, but it seems to me that that by and large has not generally happened in cities. And so does this mean basically that Baldwin was right, at least on this kind of element of the argument, that this sort of utopian idea of Jane Jacobs, that it brings people into contact and therefore can be a basis for kind of solidarity, doesn't really necessarily happen?
Or does it? We don't record it. We don't tell.
Well, it doesn't change. It doesn't succeed in changing things at a top level.
While we
That's what I
hold up Jane Jacobs as our hero at the same time.
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to ascribe something to Jane Jacobs that she would vehemently disagree with. She left New York angrily and moved to Toronto and said New York had failed. So she's not arguing that New York was doing this well. She was arguing it should have and it could have, and that instead urban planning was repeatedly destroying places like the Village and instead creating spaces that were neither public nor private and so were controlled by the people with the most power. So she is very, well, she's dead now, but she was very about the failure of New York to do exactly that.
Thanks.
What Baldwin was talking about, though, was exactly how identity categories, there's always an excess that become, when we fall through the cracks of identity, that's when, you know, and I'm just thinking about two different things. Like one is sort of the internal, like he writes, like D'Amelio writes about how we internalize this idea of heterosexuality. And so how does space sort of address not only our external, our material wants and needs, but also the ways that we suffer through our identification or lack of identification. You know, there's sort of an inside outside, and I saw that in the Jacobs Baldwin sort of putting those two together, like how does space sort of address internal, you know, internalization of ideology. Like, and so I think those are two different things. And so one is sort of an effect of, they're both maybe effects of capitalism. That's where capitalism as like the reason for all becomes complicated for me in terms of how the internal, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think what's something that's totally not visible and not what we talk about is straight space or heterosexual space, which I would think would also be two different things once we start to talk about it as we queer things. And what is that? I mean, why are we always talking about queer space? You know, what is the other 90%, Kinsey, doing? You know, like what? How did they live? How did they? I don't know. I find them really fascinating. When you think about it, how do straight people meet one? How do you know that you're straight? How does that happen? And it was something I really wanted to study for my research. And there were 3 articles on heterosexuality in space in 2008. 3 in English. And we're in English more 3. So that does not make a research study yet, but it can, and it's so pervasive and important. And how do you take it apart and to see what's happening in the internal to deal with that?
Aren't all spaces heterosexual unless they're not? I mean,
that's a good
well,
question.
I mean, sports of the last. I mean, it still amazes me that in the midst of this homophilia, I don't know what to call it. I mean, it's really sickening almost to be gay these days. You're so popular. You know, that isn't where I started, but that sports is still such a big deal. arena, and the sports locker room, can't yet even think of themselves as partially non-heterosexual. It's very strange.
And it's really attached to masculinity, to go back to the
Yeah.
point about gender
Yeah.
and how we're holding on to what masculinity, American masculinity, especially in this country, needs. And other countries, I mean, very different masculinities everywhere that we can then see in relief with its different special areas.
I've been talking in my race class about where, if we're to contest that our society is not post-racial, can we actually see evidence of pure racism or pure prejudice? And there's been some stuff written how on the street, the interactions between strangers is what indicates to you people's actual beliefs and ideas as things are changing in terms of laws and whatever. And so I bring that into my research on how gender and sexuality are made by the streets between strangers. And so I've been thinking about if there is a change or there's some sort of gaining of rights, there's a reason why there is a more hostile backlash on the streets against a particular portion of the LGBTQ community, as another portion of are the recipients of those rights. And so I've just been sort of thinking about how the streets are a heterosexual space and a place of like sort of where we internalize a heterosexual ideology and where we mitigate our genderqueer or like queer identities. And so I pair the research on catcalling against women with slurs against queers because it's sort of part of the same problem and it involves all of us kind of, and then it's racialized so heavily. And so I keep thinking of like all people, which is why it's hard for me to find where my cases are going to be exactly, but I just keep thinking, this is it, this is where the backlash is, this is how you still know you can have as many degrees as you want and it's all tits and ass. This is how you still know you can buy all kinds of corporate gayness, but you could be harassed, you know, or like, why do I keep hearing about so many trans women being murdered? Is it more of my awareness about that happening, or it's really happening more on my Facebook feed, like just constantly? There has to be, so there's this sort of tension between this, well, what I'm now going to term like this pure sexism or pure transphobia, whatever, still on the streets that is a response to these changing and gaining of rights. That's what I've been sort of thinking about.
This isn't clear yet. I'm trying to formulate it, but I know that we're talking a lot about capitalism and money and different systems, and I actually want to bring our attention to physical access as well. Someone mentioned something about a bike.
Yeah.
Right now, actually, 10 minutes before the class started, I turned to Jack and asked, do we have something for my feet so that they don't hang off the chair? Gender-neutral bathrooms on the 3rd floor, not this one. So when we talk about space, I think, and material, I think it's important to also remember one of the other communities that we have lots of connections with that is the disability community. I know someone mentioned earlier disability studies. There's this idea about how identity politics, actually one of the, there's like this famous chapter in disability studies about the end of identity politics, and what he means by that, it's Leonard Davis, and he's writing about how communities identify, or we bring identification through noticing what we're not, or where there's tension. Political movements go through different waves, and the first wave is kind of building solidarity. The second wave is kind of saying, hey, wait, what about me? I'm Spanish X. I'm, Canadian X, or, and so it complicates it. And then the third wave is really like, hey, are we that identity at all? And so it's, in disability studies, there's this new kind of intersection with queer theory and disability called crip theory. And crip theory is looking at the ways our embodiment informs our everything, and all of the structures, and how it's really the ableist, patriarchal, white,
Colonial.
That is the fiction that everyone kind of needs to come to terms with. And just as a simple example, in terms of like our community and the disability community, I fem to navigate. And it's something that I really, I'm gonna work on more with my artwork, but I'm trying to play with that idea that you know, to navigate spaces, straight spaces, or even, you know, I'm a crazy flaky artist, but even art galleries are uncomfortable for me because I'm looking at everyone's flies. You can really see the artwork. So when we talk about like spaces and identities, you know, very clearly the trans community and the intersex community has political and economic intertwinings with the disability community, healthcare, access, discrimination, visibility. I can't hide, you know.
Yeah, and so I was thinking two things. One is the like the genesis of theories is that there, you know, feminism and critical race theory start, and then if you read a lot of queer theory, you'll see a lot of comparisons to race. Like this also happens to Black people. This also happens to Asians, and it's kind of like why does it have to happen to another group to be wrong? And also, of course, it happens to many other groups. Why is it constantly this this paring down? And where's the intersectionality? Why is it like that? And why doesn't it show the actual intersectionality? And then disability studies happen, and that really draws so heavily from queer theory. And brilliantly. It's really great stuff. Leonard Davis, Robert McGrower, just the bomb. And I think that something to go back to is somebody said, like, what's this we? Was it you? I think it was you. What's happening with the we? And like, how useful are identity politics? Is that the way to move forward? Is that the way that works in a city? Is there, how do you we a city? Are we just gonna wind up homogenizing ourselves? Donna Haraway wrote in 1991, oh, back in the day,
well, how it also obfuscates like real differences, like at those intersections. You know?
Right. And it's a way to like
Because
start.
that's the thing we have in common.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, please. What is?
Because difference.
Snap.
I know. I just came up with it. You're welcome.
I just thought of what a great gallery show it would be to have a whole series, a wall full of different flies. You know. They won't ignore you.
But one more thing that I wanted to mention is within the disability community, there are people with disabilities who don't necessarily have anything else in common other than like, hey, can't reach that. Yeah, me neither. You know? Or like if I can't reach a light switch but someone can't hear, or someone sees differently, or you know, and the binding, I'm trying to find a nice little metaphor here, but the nest, okay, of the identity is that we are oppressed in a specific way, or that the thing that we have in common is that we're excluded.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
And I think that's that lesbian gay you didn't like so much that's coming across. Nice.
Me?
But that you didn't like in here, like maybe that's what's coming across, that it like he doesn't want it to be there, but it's there. And it's also the Haraway thing that's awesome, which is totally not really thought about. I don't know why it's just this identity politics. What are we gonna do with them? The third stage, and affinity politics. Like, what are the common causes we have? Like going back to gentrification or housing or clinics or access to these issues or rights. That's what could bring us together, rather than.
And then I'd love to like be an advocate for that, but then I'd love things like this, like, oh, these are my people. And we're not gathering together because like, you know, for like a political reason or something.
Well, you're also
We
like
wanna,
taking
like,
a seminar at night for fun, so. So we also have that in common. Kind of, do fun academic reading. That's the kind of person too. So there's something else brings together. Anybody else want to jump in?
I wanted to say something. I wanted to say something about straight space, because I used to work as an urban planner at a very progressive urban planning firm, and what
did they say that? Is
yeah,
that,
oh yeah, not they didn't put it in quotes, but they were their identity was that they're a progressive urban planning firm. And they literally created urban spaces in a very literal way for Buddy. And one of the, and it sort of came out of some Jane Jacob-isms, you know. And one of the sort of mission statements or whatever was that a positive public space is one where people are being affectionate. And they have like thousands of pictures on their website of people kissing and being affectionate and PDA, and that is like the emblem of their the fantastic spaces that they've created. And I worked on projects on the website, and after thousands of hours looking at these images, well, it took 1 hour of looking at the images to realize there were only straight people represented. But after thousands of hours, I finally cracked and said something. And it was like literally at this progressive planning firm, literally every single person that worked there was like, that never even occurred to us.
Oh my God.
Would they want to be in the pictures? And I was like, would they want to be in the pictures? Like you're just maintaining that you're going into amazing public spaces and taking photos, and that there are no queer people there engaging in like PDA in New York City.
And
Their photographs are from all over the world, but like I was like, and also their office used to be 2 blocks off Fitchburg Street in the West, like 2 blocks from Stonewall. Literally, when I was working there, and it was just that it was to me unfathomable, but to them just so. I mean, talk about just entrenched, right? Like that had never been queered. That there should be queer people in their images. That they were avoiding taking certain kinds of images because it's not that those images couldn't exist, right? But it was incredible. Yeah.
I mean, you've probably already thought of this, but not just that those images couldn't exist, but there is no way that firm thought cruising spaces were successful public spaces.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't, like it's not just that they're not there, like the logic is immediately completely flawed. There's no way they thought the Fulton, the street fair was a successful public space.
Yeah.
Like it's horrifying.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Just this whole conversation makes me think maybe like, I think one of the reasons they didn't think to include gay people in this whatever this PDA thing is because even in New York, we rarely see like on the subway any kind of queer PDA going on, which I always find kind of like, you know there's a lot of gay people in New York City, but I think a lot of people are really, even liberal, it's 2013, people are terrified. I see it once in a while, I see it on a subway and it's very surreptitious. I don't think I've ever seen it with gay men, but I see it once in a while with lesbians, They do it so surreptitiously, sort of like if you weren't looking for it, you kind of like not really notice it. But that's always amazed me about New York City. There are so many queer people here, but you rarely see, unless it's like at Pride or something, or like a diaper, you rarely see.
And in some way that shift, so much of the city is defined by what happens on the streets or the subways, these kind of fluid public spaces, but a lot of the way that's shifting is the drastic increase in tourism. And I don't know if you know, in 2009, New York City launched a gay pilgrimage. They called it a gay pilgrimage for tourists to come to New York to shop and stay at the Gay Hotel and other really, that wasn't open yet, but the other really nice hotels in the city, and to spend their money and to go see Stonewall and walk up and down Christopher Street. Christine Quinn was she's at the announcement, you can look it up online, the gay pilgrimage, come to the queer Mecca. And the use of those terms is vile. So thinking about that, I think it's a lot about tourism. Like I see a lot, and I hear a lot of people speaking fluently, other like Italian or whatever, Danish, along the street, thinking that they can be holding hands or making out. Like I saw two guys holding hands in Penn Station, and I was like, oh, shut the front door, what? And then I heard them speaking Norwegian. And I was like, oh, you know, but great, you don't know, like go for it. And how that kind of like global city, this metropolitan city, has this idea, so other people come here and embrace it and change it.
So,
Yeah, go ahead. I was struck by the word affection in your comment, which is what you were speaking to, right? And it reminded me of, in the D'Amelio piece, about the problem was that people in cities were attached to groups and not basically conjugally, right? And so this affection idea is basically kind of proto-conjugalism in an urban space. And so what we've done, this urban planning group, is making spaces safe for nuclear families to be nuclear in public. And so it's not that progressive, you know? And maybe they would put same-sex couples being affectionate on those websites today, but it would still be, right, it would be nuclear, it would be affectionate and not fucking.
Yeah, so I'm just asked, is there an enforcement mechanism for why you don't see especially men being affectionate in public? And does it have to do with gayness, or are we back to masculinity, which and the homophobia inherent in masculinity? I don't know. I mean, you never see it. I mean, I lived in Cairo one summer, and all the men touched each other. Of course, they couldn't touch women, but that's another story.
Anybody want to jump in? Yeah, I mean, and how much is it that women are sexualized and commodified and L-worded? Metaphor for a moment. Don't. But how does that work? You know, when we're pretty and it's okay because. Most heterosexual porn has a scene. It's like something like 97% or 98% of all porn made for straight men has a scene with two women in it. It's crazy, you know, like why, you know? And what I can get away with on the street, even though I definitely don't look like I'm not feminine in that way, but how is it okay if I do it? Because I become desexualized, because I'm butch, because it's the mannish lesbian. So those things go together. So a lot of it goes back to gender, to masculinity, to femininity, but and also about race. Again, I want to bring up race. You keep bringing up race forever. But how my whiteness makes that allowed, and how other races doesn't, or how does that work in public?
Yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about like control of public space and who. Acceptable spaces, proper spaces, what identities are allowed in those spaces, who controls those spaces, and how do you kind of reverse that? Because it is, you know, all of the various obias, you know, governing various, you know,
or occupy, like to use that word.
Yeah, absolutely. And how, you know, how do all of those things, you know, racism, homophobia, et cetera, like structure those spaces and the relationships within those spaces, and then how does that then, you know, produce people and relationships, and how we kind of navigate and feel pressures to become identified as certain things or not.
So I was thinking about
Julia, then Phil.
Okay. In the Abraham piece about the odd and oddity and what is now constructed to be odd and oddity. And so like when we're talking about gentrifications of neighborhoods and the new lesbians moving in and a desired oddity, like wanting to be the odd person on the block, and how that is so deeply entrenched in the ability to have the capital to do that in a neighborhood versus being seen as an oddity and not desired. Kind of how that changes from neighborhood to neighborhood in New York, and
depending on if you have the financial ability to stay or go. And so I just think that's interesting and how that's evolving in our city around us, because there is like this whole financial capital of normative white HRC kind of families that fit in, and then, you know, these other groups of people trying to fight back against that and being an oddity in queer community.
I was going to raise the idea of occupation versus ownership. I think it plays out a lot in terms of the loss of the neighborhoods like Twister Street Piers and Chelsea along the High Line, that there's so much money that can be made off of those physical lands now that people who own and can utilize that space are so far beyond any sort of history and engagement and ways in which we've occupied the spaces that I think the struggle that we have is trying to remain relevant in that conversation, because there's just so much money that is viable there. And the loss of those spaces may end up being inevitable, and I think that's the frustration when you're sort of witnessing happen in your lifetime.
Well, do you think we ought to form little committees and go approach the people that own the property? You know, like.
I think it would be great.
As part of Friends of the Queer, Friends of the High Line?
Yeah, I mean, I actually make my money off of it from the architects who design the High Line, so I struggle with that a lot. The idea that I see this great success that's come from it, and the purity of the ideas that they're fighting for, and the ideas themselves are, in terms of the High Line, it's about leisure. It's the purity of the idea of leisure. You just go to this place and you exist and you watch other people, and you're sort of out of and removed from the city. But the purity of that idea of leisure is trampling all these other ideas of the occupation of dissident populations, be it LGBTQ queer youth or fetish communities and whatnot. And the erasal of that is for these ideas that in themselves are kind of probably beautiful, but really destructive in terms of the ways in which they impact the lives of people who have used that space previously. And that was the argument against, some of the issues of the beautification of the High Line was about destroying the illicit. And the compromise that were there, they made gestures towards illicit behavior that happened on there, which is people climbing up to do drugs and have sex and that sort of thing.
And there were a lot of sex workers on the West Side Highway too.
And the erasal of that, you can commodify that by sort of winking at it, where you're still also destroying the things that people actually loved about those dirty spaces. So.
I mean, I'm just thinking about like in the 90s or whatever, like I used to go down there and like go to Mother and like go to that scene, But at the same time, I also went to the political meetings and they were organizing for the High Line, and I found it really offensive that they didn't invite anyone in from the projects. And they were actively, in the political process, like they were actively really against having anything that resembled like a children's playground up there. And so, yeah, well, I guess now they are, because now everybody has paid, but you know what I'm saying? Like when nobody over there had a baby, then there was no reason to have a playground, But now that like the people in charge have babies, like now they have a playground.
It will literally be like the last section that will open.
But I witnessed so many angry conversations in those meetings, like those town hall meetings, against having a playground. And I mean, that it's funny because that would have been like a straight space, like the playground on the High Line, but queer in the sense that like it was for people who weren't like the rich people from Chelsea, So it was just, it's kind of problematic. You're right, that aesthetically what came out is like, yeah, beautiful, who's going to argue with that? But the political process behind it was pretty ugly.
What's also happened in terms of all the new development that's come there is you set up new stakeholders. That by making these new places to live, you have new owners in that community. And it's sort of beyond the idea of gentrification. They're not living there because they want this safe community they can live in. They're living there to show that they can afford to live there. That for everybody else who's watching, it's out of reach to us. It's about proving that they have the status that location provides at this point.
There's a group called Picture the Homeless that's really fantastic that goes around and it counts how many empty apartments there are in condos. And there's something like, 40% in one neighborhood uptown, and I mean, most of the plaza is empty. The Plaza Hotel was made into condos, and there was a great article in the New York Times about some young woman whose grandmother bought her an apartment there, and she was afraid to go home because no one else was in the building. these places stand open. There's an $18 million mansion for sale right by President and 8th Avenue in Park Slope. It's listed as a trophy house on the website. There are so many empty, gigantic apartments. When you have that much money, that's what you do and what you buy, but it also pushes most people out. That was a question in the corner.
I think building off of the do we go to meetings and try to do things is like fierce and radical theories. It's a ton of work to stop the unification of peers. Even just to stop having a curfew there so that it can still be no curfew. Peers may have a pretty color, particularly all of these back out my peers. A lot of them are also homeless or largely housed. And there's really I can't even explain how much work they did. And there's a book, Beneath the Streets, it's written by Benjamin Shepard and talks about all public space in New York City. And he goes into it and explains exactly what they did, the types of movements, all the work that they tried to do. And they were just basically, what did they have to offer? They said, you're a homeless space, and who would you figure out that? Like, please get rid of that.
Yeah, I love what was said over here in terms of who would argue against beauty, right? Because I think previously the idea of urban renewal was like, we need to go in and clean up this space, clean up public space. Right now it's this idea of we need to go in and make things beautiful because everyone wants beauty, right? But aesthetics and beauty are themselves ways of regulating feelings of belonging, right? Who belong in certain spaces. There are different types of beauty and where certain people know they're not supposed to belong there, right? Because of the way something is produced aesthetically. So I think that rhetoric is often used to get people on board, right, in terms of changing the way something is, right? Because who would argue against beauty?
I think that's something.
Oh, sorry. I promised her.
That's right.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, go ahead. There's this also a point of view of those of us who were left in these neighborhoods, like we were the first ones who came there, and now we have our rent stabilized apartments or whatever, and we're completely surrounded by rich people. I mean, it's a very, very weird experience, because there's three of us here three of us here live in Westbeth, which is the artist housing complex, and I mean, Westbeth was started 40 years ago, and it was the first residential housing in the far West Village. I mean, the people who started Westbeth were really like pioneers. Now we're like this oasis in the middle of this super rich neighborhood. And it's not that gay anymore. I mean, it was pretty gay when I moved there about 16 years ago, but it's not anymore. So it's just like this kind of like, we're surrounded by, well, I know this probably sounds like, well, you should be so happy you live there, but it's just odd to be like feeling like you're the people left. And it's scary, actually, I think. It's just to see your neighborhood change so much, and you're not going to move because you have your rent stabilized apartment, and it's not gay anymore, and it's not artist anymore. The same thing happened in the East Village. And, but we're there, and it's like, it's just an odd feeling, to see all that change.
What will be left for you to be able to afford to buy at some point, or where to go, or?
Right, well, that's it, you can't go anywhere, or you have to leave the neighborhood, so you're not gonna leave the neighborhood, so you're either gonna stay there forever or move to a completely different neighborhood. But it's sort of like you're trapped. I mean, it's not a bad thing to be trapped in a rich neighborhood, but it's kind of weird, because, we didn't come there for that reason, and it wasn't like that when we moved there.
The ways that we also sort of talk about beauty of space is how we talk about bodies also. Like you mentioned about if it's two beautiful women, L-word style, making out on the subway, like that's, no one's gonna argue with that. And so
No one's gonna argue with beauty, because that's deemed beautiful.
Right, and I think that's how disability theory, like I study disability queer theory also, and I think that, the ways that certain masculine women are judged as monstrosities, like in the ways that certain bodies, queer bodies, are judged by other queer bodies, like particularly when we have like this massive normalization movement of the gay body, like I'm wondering how we make those links with spaces, like if we can only see some people or bodies as valuable, i.e. redeemable, worthy of employment, worthy of that space, really. And so, I don't know what that really leads to, but a redefinition of beauty or of space
and value.
And value.
Yeah.
Sorry. One thing that comes up is this notion of time, and by even doing the readings, there's the intellectualizing of the time and saying, oh, this article was written 30 years ago, or we can talk about our experience, you know, but it's a very hard thing to really wrap our head around, because here we are in 2013, and the Wild Wild West is gone. You know, Hudson Street was the dividing line, and now and one of the things that happens is things change. So I don't know, people get babies, you know, and you know, playgrounds get built, and you know, kids grow up, and hopefully they're queer, you know, and you know, but I think time is a really hard thing to fathom, because we're looking at it back. We're looking back at from 2013, and we're saying, you know, well, you know, from our experience or from the reading of it. But that's the issue that's I wanted to talk to.
No, thanks.
Yeah.
I think the hard argument of time is just like, what just happened in the last 30 years? I mean, you know, there's this article, and even just talking about our experience, and then there's AIDS, and there's going to be the sex porn wars, and then there's kind of going to be AZT. It's not really going to work, and then you know, there's going to be queer theory, and you know, gender trouble is going to come out, and you know, and everyone's going to read it over and over and over and over again, or try, but it's going to get to, you know, people talk about performance theory and you know, what it's like it's a giant blur, and we're all coming out, or not even we, or some people are coming out or coming into some sexual identities or some identities, or feeling oppressed, like I fit with you because I can't reach this thing, and we have this thing in common, but it happens at a certain moment too, you know. You know, if you were to come out and everyone around you is dying, versus you come out now and there's all these TV shows for you, or there's, you know, how has that changed? But at the same time, there's still this myth of going to the city, which is just so weird, you know, like all these things have changed, but there's still this dream of the city that's gonna save us. And now that cities have changed, which is such a good point, that's a huge part of it. Who was gonna be, it was you.
I'm sorry, this is going back 2 comments, but I'm really uncomfortable with the idea that 2 beautiful women on the subway aren't going to be questioned. That's not my experience, as in I am not making out with usually another person who's seen as beautiful, but I'm really sure that like 2 supposedly normatively gendered women who are like accepted somehow as beautiful would be fucked with in all sorts of ways, in the same way that like what's happening in all of the girl on girl porn that's made for straight men is it's all predicated on that like they need a man to come in and help them. So like what's happening if 2 people who are seen as beautiful women are making out on the subway is that they're like immediately harassed and told like, don't you want me in the middle of you? Like, yeah, I mean, exactly. So, and I think I'm uncomfortable with that, and I'm uncomfortable like making that a parallel to the beautiful space argument, because I feel like it's like just erasing immediately all the questions of like who's welcomed in beautiful space, who's welcomed as a beautiful woman, like who's not just in terms of like you can't be masculine, but you can't be, I mean, it's a white beauty norm, and it's thin and it's able-bodied, it's all of these things. So I feel like who would be a beautiful woman, and then like beautiful women would be fucked with making out in the subway. Like, I'm sure of this.
Right, so then there is the ideal of the beautiful space, but the beautiful body has totally different ramifications, which is a very good distinction. Yes, you back there?
So, I mean, I found it really interesting thinking about how capitalism created gay identity, and it made me think a lot about that J.C. Penney ad with Ellen DeGeneres and that like suburban gay family. And I organize retail workers, so I work with a lot of like LGBTQ retail workers, actually at the same time who worked at J.C. Penney when the ZAD campaign came out. And so
can you tell us what happens in the ad? I don't think I can't believe it.
So it's just like a gays, and Yana also has done work on this. It was Ellen DeGeneres, right? And it was like a suburban gay family.
I think so. What happened was JCPenney was like lauded by GLAAD and all these other like normative LGBT orgs for choosing to run two gay moms for their Mother's Day catalog, and then 2 gay dads, and then they hired Ellen as their spokesperson. So all these right-wing folks were like, "Oh, take it down," and like JCPenney stood strong and like stood up for the gay people. At the same time that like all the folks that Carrie and I work with were getting their commissions cut and laid off across the board, and it was also really interesting for me because before I was organizing wage workers and working on like living wage issues like you were talking about. I got a degree in queer history and gender studies, and then I was like, shit, I gotta go do this, like this, and then I was like spit out immediately into the marriage movement, and it's been really ironic that like doing the work that I do now has done so much more for queer people than I think any of the work that I did before was, but it's like this capitalism,
Yeah, and I think that, there's, the whole marriage movement and just the way that in which there's like, he argued, it's like 30 years ago, right? So it's like work is totally different now than it was 30 years ago, and like the people, work is like eroding,
NAFTA hasn't even happened
yet.
Yeah.
People are part-time, they're freelancing, they're just like not attached to their employer, they're like moving from one job to the next. And so like, he argues like how capitalism knocked down the material foundation away from family and gave, LGBT folks were like blamed for that social instability. And it's almost like that Ellen JCPenney campaign was this like celebration of how it was like redemption, right? Like, look, a gay family can then become a suburban gay white family can become then celebrated as the new face of the JCPenney, which is like an American retail company, and that defending that is something that we all should rally behind, right? I had like my queer friends on Facebook be like, what do I buy at JCPenney? So it's like, not from what this year though. But like, so it's like this weird thing where it was like, it came very full circle, but that it's still, was reinforcing the cycle of which it's like, that Black and immigrant gay people who are poor, who work for JCPenney are not visible and not heard and not concerned with, like the fact that JCPenney is like a massive low-wage retailer that's destroying middle-class jobs. At the same time, they're celebrating a gay middle class. Like they cut commission. It's the only way that retail workers in this country make a middle class living. At the same time, they're celebrating gay middle class people. It's just like, it was just that, like it was burning us in our office.
Just going off that, I heard from the internet, but I'm pretty sure that the huge, the collapse factory in Bangladesh that's full of those these foreign people, they were making JCPenney clothing. I just heard
Wow.
the other day, since it is Mayday. I mean, it's something to think about, and these are all queer issues.
Thank you for mentioning Mayday.
Yes, Mayday.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to build off that too and bring it to marriage race a little bit, because I think prior to the talk about the paid sick leave bill, when Chris Quinn wasn't gonna like bring it up for a vote, there was that whole critique by Gloria Steinem when she said like the big ambitions of like one woman shouldn't go before like making life a little bit better for a bunch of different people. And so it was really interesting in how like that was that queer critique by Gloria Steinem of Chris Quinn. And then I was actually just emailing with my friends a few days ago about thinking about who is backing Chris Quinn versus like some of the other candidates. So you have like HRC, the Empire State Pride Agenda, the Facebook billionaires on Chris Quinn's side, and then like, and I didn't find out who's backing like Bill Thompson, but then like Bill de Blasio has like Lady Bunny and Debbie Harry and John Kevin Mitchell and like Murray Hill. So it's just like this also really interesting divide of who's backing sort of like the figurehead queer or the figurehead LGBT person versus who on the policy level is backing the other male candidates.
So I just wanted to give a moment if you had any questions from Twitter to jump in.
There aren't actually any people asking anything right now. They just want to inform you that there's a huge conversation happening online, both in the Twitter feed and also in the live chat that comes with the video, so where we're actually live streaming.
Is there any way to save that?
Yeah, that will be saved together with the video, and they wanted to make sure that you guys know that, this is happening, and it's like sort of a parallel. So you can all experience this twice. And
That's great. Right, and I will put all of that immediately online, and the video will go up too, and you can keep commenting, and there's a thread to keep commenting and be in conversation.
It would be really simple to put a little projector on your air or whatever Mac
That's
you've
a
got.
good idea.
And, I mean, it would be distracting,
Yeah,
but
that
it would
was
be
the debate,
thrilling.
that was my inner debate, yeah. Okay, let's take a quick
could
vote,
do it for
Twitter
a short
stream
time.
next time, or?
Short time.
Short time Twitter stream next time?
Half the time. Oh.
Okay, we'll check, we'll check in.
Maybe it should be ready for next time.
Yeah, but Colin, you wanna just, maybe you were just excited. Okay, you were just waiting. Yes?
Just a comment, people have used terms like capitalism created. I don't think John was saying capitalism created, it opened a space. And gay people, I use the word gay at this case, in the 70s, actually took that space, identified themselves, and that was one of the debates at the time. Do you identify yourself as gay? Do you take that identity? If you take that identity, you're making a political statement and creating your own space with the possibilities. It's not an accident or surprise that it was gay white men and women who did that, because those are the people who had a sense of they had privilege and they weren't being given it. And the second thing is the strand that keeps coming up is this economic strand, because in the 70s, the reason the West Village and all those areas that were warehouses along 11th Avenue and such, in the crumbling road there, could exist as gay space was because nobody else wanted it. The city was falling to pieces. So there's a certain, gentrification and economic success maybe are the enemies of certain types of identity which can't exist in cities with them.
Or exist together in cities,
Together,
going back
yeah.
to your point about like the fragmentation and your fragmentation about being the island of oasis.
I mean, I just wanted I keep thinking through with my classes on LGBTQ fundamentals and stuff through this, the incestuous relationship between politicians, corporations, right, and homonormativity, let's say, and that young kids are trying to figure out, and first they're saying that they're unable to figure out whether or not they can even have a sexual identity. Someone said that yesterday and everybody nodded, which was really strange. But not really, I guess. And so they feel that they have to fall into, support Obama, not be critical of his other sort of foreign policy kind of problems, because there's a video of the gay celebrities endorsing him, and so it's become seriously dichotomized, and then I connected to, Schumann's and Foer's work on homonationalism and just traveling to wherever to support the gay rights wherever, but that being really a problem. And so I just keep thinking we've married a lot of things together that then makes it very hard to support something, be very critical, discern it from something else for young people to figure out, because everyone keeps saying they're apathetic, they actually are very interested in being involved politically and organizing politically. And so even if they just sort of get on board with maybe not the independent parties, but just the Democratic Party, kind of, because they hear it connected to gay stuff, so it makes it really hard for them to get an intersectional,
Yeah, that was something at the homonationalism and pinkwashing conference, which was here. Sponsored by CLAGS a few weeks ago. It was like a moment ago, which was really great. But a lot of the critique when I talked to really established, full professor scholars who had come, a lot of the critique they had of younger scholars who were giving papers was that they collapsed a lot of categories. That settler colonialism was gentrification, was racism, it was so weird that it kept happening that it wasn't, for lack of thinking on these parts, these really interesting, great papers, but where these categories collapsed, or is inequality grown so big that everything bad is all stuck together, and happening to everybody now. It's not like, oh, you just experienced this kind of oppression, you're gonna get it all, is that? Is that part, I mean, what else, we were trying to, reason out why would all these things be smushed together? And were they always like that? Would we have thought that way, 2007, or, 1990?
But wouldn't you have to have a singular identity to just have one thing happen? Again, most people don't have singular identities, they have multifaceted identities.
I mean, that's sort of how Occupy happened, right? That like all of these folks, and not that that's necessarily like the only best whatever model, but I think that's if we're thinking about movement, it's like we're thinking about like the breakdown and the failure of identity politics and the ways in which it's like really, really not help advance most of us and be like who are the normal gays that get whatever and all of that. Then and we're trying to think of other ways to identify or to not identify, and then you do it based on income inequality, and then you're like, okay, the 99%. It's like, I mean, it's sort of it's one of the first ways in my lifetime that I think I've seen that happen.
And that really reached across different politics too, which was a big shift.
That's one of the problems though with intersectionality, is that it starts to become.
For those of you who don't know what intersectionality is a term created by Kimberly Crenshaw Williams in 1995. It was like, hey, I can be black and a woman at the same time. Isn't that crazy? No, not really. And this is what happens when you have multiple identities at once. Okay, so just that word's been thrown around. I just wanted to put it out.
No, and I noticed that at the conference also, and I think that, I mean, I agree that it's just, everything is sort of tied together, but I think that there's also room to be more specific at times. And I think that that's where, in my work, like I use lesbian and queer together because they do different things, right? And they're different for a reason. And I think keeping some of that specificity alive, and also within groups like this, I mean, I think that the ways that we can sort of recognize our privilege and also recognize how we lack privilege and sort of own that and understand it, I think that also we can start to sort of, I don't know, like when we get into these conversations about marriage, for example, like I think that it becomes sort of more derisive if we start to pit those who want gay marriage versus those who think that there are other issues. And I've seen that play out over and over and over again. Like, and I don't know where I'm really going with that, but in terms of like the flattening of terms, like I think that's one of the potential reasons is that you cannot study, like as Judith Butler has written, like everything is always partial. Like you're always going to have partial understanding of an issue. And so I think wanting to take it all on is very noble, but in the end can be sort of its own undoing.
And yet you need alliances politically, and if you become univocal on one set of issues, you end up oppressing other people.
It's a fine line. I mean, it's a really difficult dance, right? Yeah, I think that's the piece.
I don't think intersectionality is about collapsing.
Oh, can you be a little bit louder? I think it's the acoustic.
Sorry, I don't think intersectionality is about collapsing identities as much as understanding that people straddle and equal, and you need to include all of them. And in fact, I think that would give you more political alliances as you'd be reaching out to everything slash intersectionality. Equalism. We can keep going around the circle, and then you have alliances within all of them.
Right, absolutely, but when you have a span of a 20-page paper, and you're trying to address race, disability, class, gender, clowns, circuses, balloons, and monkeys,
I
think
too. I think there's still writers out there. I think there's a lot of queer people of color who have been doing work and are still doing work. You get that because they lived it and they know the way to write that out and make that very, very clear. I mean, going back to Audre Lorde, I mean, we can say that Kimberly Crenshaw invented intersectionality, but Audre Lorde is the one who talks about difference. He talks about that we need to understand these multiple ways of being. I think if you're living that, there are people who are doing it. I think just the thing the canon doesn't allow for that to come out and be heard. But people are doing it and living it and happen.
Since we've invoked the wonderful Audre Lorde, I think it's a lovely moment to kind of bring us together to conclude and just, I want to just briefly give you a heads up about next week, which includes the fabulous, utterly awesome Joan Nessel. And if you've never met Joan, she's just
fabulous.
She's fabulous. She's wonderful. And it'll be a great experience with her. She was a CUNY professor and writer and scholar and radical and activist and helped the found work in University Archives. And then next up is Lauren Smelia interviewing Maxine Wolf. If you don't know Max, she actually left a tenured position to go pretty much be an activist full time, and you can still often find her at the Lesbian Arts Archive. She's fantastic. And you will hear her voice loud and clear and about her work helping to found and be a big part of ACT UP and Lesbian Avengers. And then, who doesn't, what about Stonewall, right? Was that the beginning? Why did we have that idea? And Elizabeth Armstrong and Susanna Craig wrote this awesome piece called Movements in Memory, the Making of the Stonewall Myth. Which I love and I'm so glad exists. But this next section is about placemaking, getting back to the bar, which is so important to LGBTQ culture and identity. And why is that way? And for the other institutions that make that up, and what are the spaces between them and the city that make the cities useful for us. So again, you can go out and tweet in the future and join in the conversation here as well, which is really awesome, and on the site. And if you have any questions, you can email me. Sometimes it takes a few days because there are now 240 people enrolled in this course. This is the largest CLAGS seminar ever. How many people have been to the CLAGS seminar before? What do you think?
Well,
I did queer migrations a bunch of years ago, and there was like 12 people.
Okay, so there's a lot of, and I want you all, I want to really support your conversation and help you grow that. So there's different ways to do that. If you do not know how to use a blog or make a comment, email me. I will help you. I really will. It's not hard. You feel like enlightened. Thank you all for coming.